We're continuing from our previous part of the story about the Hell of Marines, which you can and should watch right here if you haven't. The first battle to come was the first real test for that amphibious landing on the heavily defended beach Marines had been preparing for so long. And as it turned out, no amount of preparation could make up for the lack of experience. To push their way towards Japan in what's now called the Island Hopping Campaign, the 2nd Marine Division now had the place called Tarawa on their to-do list. There was a crucial airfield on the little island of Bessio that put the Marianas Islands in range for bombers, and the whole offensive could then continue from there. So Tarawa is an atoll, a ring-shaped chain of small, low coral islands, most of them slivers of sand and palm trees a few feet above sea level. But it was now literally the most heavily fortified place per square mile in the world. The Japanese knew how important it was, and they didn't want to give it up so easily. So they spent over a year fortifying those little islands. And Bessio was the first one to be hit, on November 20th, 1943. Defending this fortress of an island was a garrison of about 4,800 men, the 2,600-man corps being Rikusentai, Japan's elite naval marines. These were fanatical first-class soldiers that you had to kill if you wanted to win the battle. So it all began as planned, with ships and fighter aircraft dropping some 3,000 tons of explosives on the little island in the hours before the landing. It looked like the island was obliterated. However, because of the extensive defenses and most of the shells hitting the soft sand that absorbed the explosions without damaging the nearby pillboxes, the Japanese defenders were pretty much alive and ready. Then, at 9 o'clock, the LVTs began their approach. 3 waves of Marines hit 3 designated beaches, with a 4th wave behind them in Higgins boats. Now, if you remember when we talked about the landing craft earlier, the LVT had tracks and could go through water and over reefs without getting stuck. And they did. Slowly but surely, they were driving towards the beaches, while getting picked off by the Japanese cannons and machine guns. Although taking heavy casualties, several hundred Marines from the first 3 waves were ashore. Then the Higgins boats went in and reached the reef, where the water was only about 3 feet deep because of the low tide. The High Command had actually been warned about the tide, but they pressed on with the attack anyway, and you can probably guess what happened with the boats. They got stranded about 600 yards from the beaches, packed with men in plain sight of every Japanese weapon on shore. With no other way, the Marines jumped out into the chest-deep water and began a slow walk towards the beach through heavy Japanese fire. It was just a massacre. Some companies took 70% casualties just on the walk from the boats to the beach. And those who reached the beach had their own hell just beginning. Because the whole island was an interlocking kill zone. Communication broke down. Tanks were used without coordination and weren't prepared for wading through deep water, so most of them just got their engines drowned and stopped, while some even fell into deep shell holes and got their whole crews drowned. The first amphibious landing in Marine Corps history was on the verge of being thrown back into the sea. By mid-afternoon, the remaining Marines organized themselves however they could, and began attacking in small groups, 1 pillbox at a time. By nightfall, out of the 5,000 Marines that landed, about 1,500 were dead, wounded, or missing, while the Japanese still held most of the island. However, by near miracle, no large Japanese counterattack came through the first night, which would have surely obliterated the Marines, who were barely holding on. At dawn, the tide was a little better, and reinforcements could come a bit closer to shore and bring much-needed help on the beach. The 3rd and 4th days saw horrific close-quarters fighting until the last organized Japanese resistance was finally killed. By the time the island was declared secure, out of the 4,800 Japanese, only 17 were alive in American custody. The rest were dead. Marines had taken the island in 76 hours, but they had lost about 1,000 men, with over 2,000 wounded, which just shocked everyone. No one could even imagine that such a bloodbath was possible. However, as it turned out, it was only going to be the first one. But the Marines learned from the lessons on Tarawa and then took the Marshall Islands with a fraction of the casualties, and the road through the Central Pacific was now finally open. The next stop was Saipan. And here's where it gets bad again. Saipan had about 30,000 Japanese civilians living there, and losing it would be a huge problem for the Japanese defensive ring around the home islands. So it was ordered to be defended to the last man. The landing on Saipan on June 15, 1944, wasn't a Tarawa-style disaster, as the Marines had now learned from their mistakes, and they now put 8,000 men ashore in the first 20 minutes, with about 20,000 by nightfall, although still taking about 2,000 casualties from the artillery. However, the Japanese had also learned. They'd seen that fortifications on the beach itself were exposed to naval bombardment, and that stopping the Marines on the beaches wasn't the best tactic. Instead, let them land, hide inland, where it's safer from bombardment, and then make their lives as bad as they could get once they think the worst is over. Saipan had mountains, caves, ridges, and jungle, with the Japanese hid their artillery and prepared firing zones across the exact ground US Marines would be going through. You can guess what happened when they went down those exact roads. The Japanese here fought from caves on a scale that Marines hadn't seen before and showed them just how difficult it was to flush them out. And in those same caves, mixed in with the Japanese soldiers, were also civilians. The Marines couldn't tell who was who when they fired, and what they saw in there was something we can't even describe here. However, something would happen on Saipan that had never happened on this scale before. When the Japanese were pushed into the northern third of the island, and with water, food, and ammo running out with no possibility of being resupplied or evacuated, they chose to go out in style and take out as many Americans with them as possible. At dawn on July 7th, between 3,000 and 4,000 surviving Japanese soldiers, civilians, and walking wounded came out of caves and stormed American positions. They overran the shocked Americans, and horrible hand-to-hand fighting lasted for 15 hours until the entire Japanese force was dead. They killed around 650 Americans in the largest Banzai charge in history. But if you think the hell for the Marines was over on Saipan, well, think again. Because something happened that Marines would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The northern point of Saipan ended with 200-foot sea cliffs. There were surviving Japanese civilians, whole families poisoned by propaganda stories of what would happen if they fell into American hands. So a lot of them chose not to. You can imagine the rest. The Marines couldn't stop it, even though they tried. They brought captured Japanese civilians to speak over megaphones at the cliff edge to try to convince the families that nothing would happen to them. Some believed them and surrendered, but many didn't. If you want to horrify yourself, you can research this later on the internet, but I honestly don't recommend it. Saipan now brought Tokyo within B-29 Superfortress range, but for the Marines, the biggest hell was still ahead, because the Japanese command had drawn the same conclusion the Marines had. Banzai charges and beach defenses had failed at Tarawa, Kawaja Line, and now Saipan. The next islands wouldn't be defended with the same tactics. They would be defended in a new way, from deep inside caves and tunnels, where the Marines would have to go in and dig them out one by one, and that way was going to be worse than anything before. So the Japanese turned to something they called fukaku, and although I surely didn't pronounce it right, it meant something like fortified zone defense. The idea was not to win or to really survive, but to bleed the enemy as much as possible for as long as possible, so that their victory would be Pyrrhic. They'd let the US Marines land and think that the worst was over, then show them the worst possible form of combat as they went further inland, and they did it. Next on the line was a place called Peleliu, although many commanders said the island didn't have any strategic value and that it could simply be bypassed and put under siege until the Japanese either starved or surrendered, but no, the order came out that it must be taken. However, this island was manned by some 11,000 Japanese troops that turned the 7-square-mile island into an absolute fortress. It had high jagged coral and limestone rising out of the jungle, not like a mountain in the normal sense, but broken, twisted ridges, cliffs, and rocks so sharp they could literally cut through boots. And inside it was a system of about 500 caves, some natural, some former mine shafts which the Japanese then connected neatly together into one underground network that would protect them from naval bombardment and then cause hell for the Marines who were about to come. They had whole artillery pieces dug into the rock with steel doors and tiny slits for single soldiers. from which they had a perfect line of fire while remaining unseen. They pre-ranged artillery and pulled most men into the caves, while only one battalion was left forward at the beach, with orders to disrupt the landing and then fall back into caves and wait for the Marines to come to them. The 1st Marine Division was given the job. Their commander confidently said that Peleliu would be over in 3 or 4 days. Probably even 2. Marines were told that after naval bombardment, they'd come in just to mop up. So it was now September 15th, 1944, at 8:32 a.m., and the Marines hit the beaches. As the LVTs approached the beach, the Japanese artillery, unfazed by the bombardment, opened the steel doors and opened up. Within an hour, they destroyed around 60 LVTs, and you can only imagine the casualties. Now, the fighting had really begun on a coral and rock surface in 115 degrees Fahrenheit, without fresh water on the island. In early water supply runs, Marines got old oil drums filled with water that hadn't been washed properly, so the water had oil in it, which then made men violently sick. So Marines began collapsing from heat and dehydration, not to mention the casualties the Japanese were inflicting from well-prepared positions. By nightfall on day 1, the Marines held a beachhead and not much else, while they took 1,100 casualties on the first day. The 1st Marines had been given the worst job on the island, to assault that well-fortified ridge. The core surface was so hard, you couldn't dig a foxhole, and it multiplied the blasts of every artillery shell landing because it shattered into shrapnel, and the hard surface spread the blast much more than a soft surface like sand would. There was no cover, and the ridges were one big, interconnected, interlocking killing zone for Marines. They'd be shot from 2 or 3 sides at the same time, they couldn't even see where the fire was coming from, and even if they tossed a grenade in the firing slit, it would do little to nothing. Positions were prepared in a way that a blast would be contained in a small portion of each one, and could be remanned immediately after exploding. And when I said that you couldn't dig a foxhole, you also couldn't dig a grave. There were now thousands of dead from both sides lying all over the small island, in 115-degree heat. So you can now understand why the smell was something surviving Marines said they would never forget. By day 6, the 1st Marines had effectively been destroyed. They had 55% casualties, while the rest was shell-shocked, dehydrated, and simply couldn't take it anymore. So 1st Marines were relieved by the Army's 321st Infantry Regiment. But the battle wasn't over. Far from it, actually. It had only just begun. While the army switched mostly to siege tactics and armored bulldozers to seal cave entrances, the 7th Marines went up, took 46% casualties, and had to be relieved by the 5th Marines, who then took 43% casualties. Instead of that 2 or 3 day mop-up action that was so enthusiastically predicted, the battle ended 73 days after the landing. Almost 10,000 American casualties, 6,500 of them Marines. As for the Japanese, out of some 11,000 of them there, fewer than 300 were taken prisoner. And to then add insult to injury, the captured island had pretty much no role in the war, and this whole hell could easily have been avoided. But do you think the High Command would learn from thousands of men dying because of their mistakes? Nah, because the next island is only going to get worse. Iwo Jima. Halfway between Saipan and Japan, on the bomber's flight path was this little volcanic island with 2 Japanese airfields on it. 8 square miles of black sand and rock where the Japanese had radar and launched fighter planes and small raids from. So the High Command wanted it gone. 3 Marine divisions were assigned to take care of it, and American intelligence estimated the operation would take about a week. And by now you probably know how accurate their predictions really were. Now, on Iwo Jima was the Japanese commander Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, who studied what had happened on previous islands and corrected every mistake the Japanese made there. He forbade Banzai charges, he forbade firing on the Marines landing on beaches, and he didn't even attempt to stop them. The real defense was going to be underground in over 11 miles of tunnels through the volcanic rock on an 8 square mile island. They had everything underground, relatively protected from the heaviest bombardment America could throw at them. The whole island was simply one well-prepared kill zone. Each Japanese soldier got the order that he must not die before killing at least 10 Americans. And there were 21,000 of them, all of them knowing that they were going to die. So the 3-day pre-invasion bombardment was now the heaviest of the entire Pacific War, and the island looked like it was being burned down from the air. Then on February 19, 1945 at 9 a.m., the first Marines hit the beaches of Iwo Jima, and they were shocked by the amount of fire the Japanese were putting out, because the amount was zero. It was also quiet and calm, that something must have been wrong. For the entire hour, waves of Marines packed themselves on the beaches and nothing was happening. Perhaps the bombardment had killed every living thing on the island. The beach was now packed with men, vehicles, ammunition, and supplies getting stuck in that soft volcanic ash. And Kobayashi had been waiting for exactly this. It was now time. Every Japanese gun on the island opened fire, already pre-sighted on the beaches, now crammed with Marines. Mortars, machine guns, heavy artillery, anti-tank guns all began firing simultaneously from hidden positions that were unscratched by the bombardment. Marines were simply lying on the beach where they couldn't dig in. They couldn't move forward or back to the ships, just lying there and getting obliterated. They took about 80% casualties in less than a day, but they somehow managed to push inland from this hell on the beaches. However, the real hell was now only just getting started. You know the drill by now. The same horrifying way of fighting seen on Peleliu was repeated on Iwo Jima, just on an even larger scale. Marines put the flag up on Suribachi on day 5 in that famous photo which let the people back home think the fighting was over, when in reality it lasted for 31 more days. However, Marines now had a weapon that would perhaps be the reason that they took the island without all of them dying. Flamethrowers and flame tanks. 8 Sherman Zippos landed on Iwo Jima, and they became the most valuable weapon for the Marines there, which, by the way, we have a whole video about that you can watch later if you want. So 36 days after the landing, out of 21,000 Japanese, 216 were taken prisoner alive. The rest are still, to this day, on that island. Most of them in those underground tunnels, sealed forever. On the other side were about 6,800 Americans dead, most of them Marines, 20,000 more wounded, and this was the only battle the United States fought against Japan where total American casualties were greater than the Japanese. This is when you count both wounded and killed, although the Japanese had many more killed because they wouldn't surrender. However, if you think that it was time to reconsider the strategies and maybe try a different approach than landing men on beaches and making them push inland against prepared pillboxes, oh, well, think again. There's one more stop for the Marines, which is going to be quite different than anything they've seen so far. By the spring of 1945, the road to Tokyo was almost finished, but there was still one more stop closer to Japan, where the Allies could stage hundreds of thousands of troops for the planned invasion of the Japanese mainland. And that would be Okinawa. Now, this island was about 60 times larger than Iwo Jima. It had towns and 300,000 civilians on it, and you already know what they were being told would happen to them if the Americans ever came. Well, now they came. And for the Japanese, losing the last barrier before the home islands meant losing the war completely, so they committed to defending it with all they had. The Americans assembled the largest amphibious operation of the entire Pacific War, with some 88,000 Marines ready to go ashore. Waiting for them were about 100,000 Japanese troops, dug into the southern third of the island, with the same plan as for Iwo Jima. They knew they weren't going to win this battle, but they were going to make the price of Americans winning as high as possible. Hills and ridges were again honeycombed with caves and tunnels, just like on Iwo Jima, just on a much larger battlefield. The heaviest amphibious bombardment of the entire war then came in preparation for the landing, and it was now April 1st, 1945. 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, alongside 2 Army divisions, hit the western beaches at 8:30 in the morning. And yet again, nothing happened. A few artillery rounds came in, but that was it. By nightfall, more than 60,000 American troops were ashore without trouble. But the veterans of Iwo Jima knew it was just too good to be true, and that the Japanese had surely thought of something. And they were right. The first 2 weeks went easy, and they cleared 2/3 of the island, yes, still fighting, but nothing like the hell of the previous islands. Marines now began thinking that this one was finally going to be different, but it wasn't. It was just delayed. They hit the outer defenses of the fortified Japanese line and a place called Kakazu Ridge and stopped dead. Here it goes again, now the longest, most attritional ground battle the US fought against Japan in the entire war. The same pattern seen on Iwo Jima now repeated itself at scale, plus the rain when the spring monsoon arrived. The tanks bogged down, supplies couldn't go in, wounded couldn't go out other than carried by hand, and the dead again lay in the open, with Marines now living among them. There were over 26,000 recorded cases of psychiatric breakdowns that put men out of action. And I can't even pretend here that I understand. Because I don't, as no one who wasn't there does. On a single hill called Sugarloaf, the 6th Marine Division took as many casualties in a week as the entire Battle of Tarawa. And while all of this was going on, the 300,000 civilians were in the crossfire getting killed by both sides. Americans couldn't know who was inside those caves when they fired a flamethrower or sealed the entrance with explosives. We can't even talk about the details of what was happening to them, but by the time the battle ended, about a third of the entire island's population was gone. In 82 days of continuous fighting on Okinawa, about 49,000 American casualties, out of which 12,000 killed or missing. Of those, 3,000 were Marines killed in action, and about 14,000 were wounded. On the Japanese side, around 100,000 soldiers were killed. And here's where the Americans started thinking. If almost 50,000 Americans got killed and wounded on an island where there were 100,000 Japanese soldiers, what would happen on the home islands, where there were millions of them, plus all the civilians? They calculated that they could realistically expect between 500,000 and over 1 million American casualties, with Japanese deaths in the millions, if they had gone on with the planned Operation Downfall. Luckily, it never happened, because the war finally ended after 2 atomic bombs, so the Marines at least didn't have to invade Japan itself, which would probably have made everything that happened before seem like nothing. By the end of the war, the US Marine Corps had around 20,000 killed in action, with another 70,000 wounded, almost all of them in the Pacific. They had fewer men lost overall than the Army, but the Army was vastly larger. The Marines actually had twice the death rate of the Army if measured proportionally, and most of those deaths were concentrated in those short but incredibly violent battles they fought across the ocean from Guadalcanal all the way to Okinawa. If you really want to give yourself PTSD, you can read the book With the Old Breed, written by Eugene Sledge, a Marine that went through Peleliu and Okinawa and described what he saw there.